Hi everybody. I am going to do something a little bit different today. I wanted to spend some time comparing stories that are similar and things about some two stories that are different. And I decided I would do that with Little Red Riding Hood. And I don't have a copy of the Little Red Riding Hood book at home. And so I found a copy of the story online. And so I want to talk to you a little bit before I read it about how you listen to stories when you cannot see the pictures. So we have talked about this a little bit, and I just want to give you a reminder that when you are hearing a story that does not have pictures that you can see, where do the pictures have to come from? Do you remember? So the pictures come from your imagination when you are hearing a story, but you cannot see the pictures with your eyes. You have to kind of turn your brain into a little movie screen where you listen to the words and you create the pictures in your mind that go with the words that you're hearing. So it'll be helpful that I will be reading a story to you that will be familiar to most of you because I have read this in class. But you might not remember all the details. So I'm going to read the original Little Red Riding Hood story, and you won't be able to see the pictures. But then I'm going to read a story that was inspired by Little Red Riding Hood, which means that the author of the other story that I read got the idea for the story that she wrote by knowing the story of Little Red Riding Hood. So first, you'll listen to the story of Little Red Riding Hood, and you'll make the pictures in your mind because they won't be there for you to look at. And then we'll hear a story that does have pictures that was inspired by, which means the ideas came from Little Red Riding Hood, but the story is a little bit different. So lots of thinking that needs to happen today so that you can understand the stories that you're hearing and so that you can start to think about things that are similar, which means the same, and things that are different between the two stories. You're going to make a comparison. You're going to compare the two. Think about the things that are the same. Think about the things that are different. That's what it means to compare two things. So here we go, Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived in a village near the forest. Whenever she went out, the little girl wore a red riding cloak, which is like a long, kind of a combination between a jacket and a dress, a long coat that looks like a dress. It's called a cloak. So everyone in the village called her Little Red Riding Hood because it had a hood. One morning, Little Red Riding Hood asked her mother if she could go visit her grandmother, as it had been a while since she had seen her. "That's a good idea," said her mother. So they packed a nice basket for Little Red Riding Hood to take to her grandmother. When the basket was ready, the little girl put on her red cloak and kissed her mother goodbye. "Remember," said her mother, "go straight to Grandma's house. Don't dawdle along the way. And please don't talk to strangers. The woods are dangerous." "Don't worry, Mommy," said Little Red Riding Hood. "I'll be careful." But when Little Red Riding Hood noticed some lovely flowers in the woods, she forgot her promise to her mother. She picked a few, watched the butterflies flit about for a while, listened to the frogs croaking, and then picked a few more. Little Red Riding Hood was enjoying the warm summer day so much that she didn't notice a dark shadow approaching from the forest behind her. Suddenly, a wolf appeared beside her. "What are you doing out here, little girl?" said the wolf in a voice as friendly as he could muster. "Oh, I'm on my way to see my grandma who lives in the forest, near the brook." Brook is another word for a little stream or creek. Little Red Riding Hood said back to him, and then she realized how late she was and quickly excused herself, rushing down the path to her grandma's house. The wolf, in the meantime, took a shortcut. The wolf, a little out of breath from running, arrived at Grandma's house and knocked lightly on the door. "Oh, thank goodness, dear. Come in. I was worried sick that something had happened to you in the forest," said her grandmother, thinking that the knock was her granddaughter. The wolf let himself in. Poor Granny didn't have time to say another word before the wolf gobbled her right up. The wolf let out a satisfied burp and then poked through Granny's wardrobe to find a nightgown that he liked. He added a frilly sleeping cap and, for good measure, dabbed on some of Granny's perfume right behind his pointy ears. A few minutes later, Little Red Riding Hood knocked on the door. The wolf jumped into bed and pulled the covers up right over his nose. "Who is it?" he called in a cackly voice. "It's me, Little Red Riding Hood." "Oh, how lovely! Do come in, dear," cracked the wolf. When Little Red Riding Hood entered the little cottage, she could barely recognize her grandmother, which means she wasn't sure that it was her. "Grandmother, your voice, it sounds so odd. Is something the matter?" she asked. "Oh, I just have a touch of the cold," squeaked the wolf, adding a cough at the end to prove his point. "But grandmother, what big ears you have," Little Red Riding Hood said as she edged closer to the bed. "The better to hear you with, my dear," replied the wolf. "But grandmother, what big eyes you have," said Little Red Riding Hood. "The better to see you with, my dear," replied the wolf. "But grandmother, what big teeth you have," said Little Red Riding Hood, her voice starting to quiver, which means to shake a little bit. "The better to eat you with, my dear," and the wolf leapt right out of the bed and began to chase the little girl. Almost too late, Little Red Riding Hood realized that the person in the bed was not her grandmother, but a hungry wolf. She ran across the room, through the door, and shouted, "Help, wolf!" as loudly as she could. A woodsman who was chopping logs nearby heard her cry and ran toward the cottage as fast as he could. He grabbed the wolf and made him spit out the poor grandmother, who was a bit frazzled by the whole experience, but still in one piece. "Oh, Grandma, I was so scared," cried Little Red Riding Hood. "I'll never speak to strangers or dawdle in the forest again." I didn't stop on that word dawdle the first time we heard it. Dawdle just means to play around and not be focused on what you're supposed to be doing. So when she was picking the flowers, she could have been told to be dawdling. When she was talking to the wolf, she was dawdling a little bit. So it just means not staying focused on what you're supposed to do and doing something else along the way, or instead getting distracted by other things. There, child, you've learned an important lesson. Thank goodness you shouted loud enough for this kind gentleman to hear you." The woodsman knocked out the wolf and carried him deep into the forest, where he wouldn't bother anyone any longer. Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother had a nice lunch and a long chat. And that's the end of kind of a more original version of Little Red Riding Hood. So even that story, you'll hear it different times and in slightly different ways. But the general important points and things that happen in the story are the same, no matter how you hear it or where you hear it. So that's Little Red Riding Hood. Keep all of those details in your head. That is one of the stories we've talked about, stories that have lived for years and years and years and years, maybe more than 100 years or longer. And Little Red Riding Hood is one of those stories, one of those stories that's been around forever, for years. And if you think about a lesson that might come from a story, there's definitely a lesson that might come from Little Red Riding Hood. And that is that when you have a specific direction that's meant to keep you safe, it's really important to follow it and to listen to the people who care about you when they give you directions, because they're meant to keep you safe and well. And if you don't follow those directions, sometimes things go a little bit wrong, which is the case with Little Red Riding Hood. So that's another aspect of the story that keeps it being told over and over and over and over again, because it has a great lesson. So another story that is not Little Red Riding Hood, but definitely came from the idea, was inspired by Little Red Riding Hood, is called Little Red Cowboy Hat. And we have also read this story, but not for a long time. It was written by Susan Lowell and illustrated by Randy Cecil. And it's a bit of a different version. And I want you to think about what's different and what's the same. Think about how to compare the two stories. Little Red Cowboy Hat. Once upon a ranch, far away in the wilds of the West, there lived a little girl with red hair. Her hair was a fine color, somewhere between firecrackers and new pennies. And to top it off, her grandma gave her a bright red cowboy hat. So everybody called her Lil Red Cowboy Hat, or Lil Red for short. One day her mother said, "Lil Red, your grandma's sick in bed. Ride over there and take her this loaf of homemade bread and jar of cactus jelly." "Yes, ma'am," said Little Red, who loved to visit her grandmother. "Don't dilly-dally," same thing as dawdle, "along the way," warned her mother. "No, ma'am," said Little Red. "And be careful," her mother said. "It's rattlesnake season." "Yes, ma'am." Little Red put her cowboy hat on her head and saddled her buckskin pony. She packed the loaf of bread and jar of jelly in her saddlebag, and then she set off for her grandmother's ranch, several miles away. First, she rode down into a deep canyon. Clink, clunk, crunch, clink, clunk, crunch, clink, clunk, crunch, went the pony's feet, striking sparks from the rocks. Next, she rode up onto a wide mesa where gold poppies and blue lupins blossomed in the grass. "Grandma loves flowers," thought Little Red. "I'll just stop for a minute." And as she was picking wildflowers, she heard her pony give a snort. "Whoa, Buck," said Little Red, turning around. "A snake?" she wondered. Now, if you look at that illustration, you can see why the pony was giving a little snort. And then she saw the wolf. "Howdy, little girl," he said. He wore a cowboy hat 3 shades blacker than a locomotive. "Hi," she said. The wolf stood between her and the pony. She didn't want to talk to him, but she'd been raised to be polite. "What's your name, honey?" he asked. He came closer than she liked. "Lil Red Cowboy Hat," she answered reluctantly. She'd also been raised to tell the truth. "Red?" said the wolf. A creepy feeling ran up her backbone and tingled in the roots of her hair. "Red as in ketchup?" he asked. She didn't answer. He was much too close. She could count the teeth in his smile. "Where are you going, sugar?" he asked. "Why not take a little ride with me?" Just then the pony whinnied and reared. "Whoa, Buck!" cried Lil Red. The wolf leaped away from Buck's hard hooves, and Little Red seized the reins and jumped safely into the saddle. "To Grandma's house!" she shouted as they rode away. When Lil Red reached her grandmother's ranch, she didn't hear a sound except the windmill creaking. Screek, screek, screek. The chickens didn't even cluck. Usually Grandma was outside doctoring a cow or mixing cement, but now nothing moved except 3 buzzards circling high in the sky. Poor Grandma, thought Lil Red. She tied Buck to the hitching post and tippy-toed into the ranch house. It was as quiet as a tree full of owls. "Grandma?" she called softly. She saw a big lump in her grandmother's bed. The lacy edge of the grandma's shower cap peeked out over above the patchwork quilt. "I brought you some bread and jelly," said Lil Red. "Thank you, honey bun," said a muffled voice. Thump! What was that thump outside? Little Red stiffened. Something was wrong. "Grandma," she said, "is that you?" "Of course it is, sweetie." "I can't see you," said Little Red suspiciously. The lump moved. Deep down in the bedclothes, which are the sheets and blankets, a strange dark eye glittered. "Shoot," thought Lil Red. "Grandma must be real sick." "What big eyes you have, Grandma," she said. "The better to see you with, Pumpkin," said the voice. Ka-thump came the noise from outside again. The quilt fell away from a huge, hairy muzzle. Muzzle is the front of an animal's face, where their mouth and nose are. Now Little Red Cowboy Hat knew perfectly well this was not her grandmother, but where was Grandma? She decided to string the wolf along until she found out. So she went on bravely. What a big nose you have, Grandma. The better to smell you with, Dumpling, said the figure in the bed. Thump, thump, came the noise from outside again. And what sharp teeth you have, Grandma. The better to eat you with, Angel Pie. And the wolf sat bolt upright and grabbed Little Red Cowboy Hat. Thump, 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 came the noise from outside. Ow, she screamed. Quiet, you delicious morsel, he snarled. Oh, no you don't, cried a familiar voice. Get your paws off her, you varmint. And there was Little Red Cowboy Hat's grandma with an axe in her hand. She had been outside chopping wood. The wolf dropped Little Red like a hot potato and made a break for the window. Are you all right, Red? Called Grandma. Yes, ma'am, said Little Red. The wolf tripped over his nightgown, got stuck in the window. His tail waved helplessly behind him. Meanwhile, Grandma snatched her shotgun from the mantel. She chased him out the door, yelling things like this. Take that, you low-life Lobo! Come on, Red! Little Red leaped onto Buck and twirled her lasso, and together they chased the wolf down the road. Tut, 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 cried the chickens. No, no, called the cattle. Breaking into my house, puffed Grandma. Wearing my clothes, getting fleas in my bed, messing with my granddaughter. You'd look mighty good as a rug, Mr. Wolf. Later, back at the ranch, Little Red Cowboy Hat and her grandma sat down to eat their bread and cactus jelly. Now, Red, have you learned your lesson? Asked Grandma. Yep, a girl's got to stick up for herself, said Little Red. Her wind-blown hair glowed in the light of the setting sun. It was a fine color, somewhere between autumn leaves and chili peppers, and Grandma smiled as she smoothed it down. That yellow-bellied, snake-blooded, skunk-eyed, rancid son of a parallelogram, she said. This time he picked the wrong grandma. And they never had any wolf trouble again around her ranch. And that's the end. So if you think about how those two stories compare to each other, you can think about the things that are the same and the things that are different. Some of the main things to get you started in thinking about that are that the characters are very similar. Both stories have a mom, a little girl, and a grandma. So if you imagined putting those similarities in the middle of a picture, then you could put the other things on the outside. The things that are different could go on the outside. For example, in Little Red Riding Hood, you might put on the outside that the little girl wore a red riding cloak. On the outside of Little Red Cowboy Hat, you might put that the girl wore a red cowboy hat and cowboy boots. So those are things that are different, even though the characters are very similar, or something that you might consider to be the same. Two little girls, two moms, two grandmas. Also in the middle, there's a wolf in both stories. So in the middle of a picture where you're comparing things and looking at things that are similar, you might put the wolf. There's a wolf in Little Red Riding Hood, and there's a wolf in Little Red Cowboy Hat. So if you go through the whole story and compare, you'll see that there ends up to be lots of things that are the same and lots of things that are different. And one of the things that really good authors do is get inspiration or ideas from other stories that have been around for a really, really, really long time and are very familiar to people. That's what makes it fun to listen to the stories that are a little different, like Little Red Cowboy Hat. So think about that. Think about things that are the same and different between the two stories, and I'll see you tomorrow.